The morning Wallace Talbot rode out of Caldwell, Kansas, with a woman he had never met sitting rigid in the wagon seat beside him, he told himself it would be the simplest job of his life, and he had never been more wrong about anything. It was the spring of 1879, and the plains were alive with the kind of beauty that fooled a man into thinking the world was gentle. Wildflowers had pushed up through the cracked red earth along the trail south, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only existed in Kansas in April, deep and wide, and honest as a preacher's promise. Wallace Talbot was 28 years old, sun-weathered and quiet, with hands calloused from a decade of ranch work and a jaw that had been broken once and healed slightly crooked, giving him a look of permanent stubbornness that people often mistook for meanness. He was neither mean nor stubborn by nature. He was simply careful, the way a man learns to be careful when life has knocked him down enough times. He had taken the job because he needed the money. It was as uncomplicated as that. Frank Heller, who ran the freight and transport operation out of Caldwell, had offered him $15 to drive a wagon south to the Aldridge Ranch, a large cattle operation sitting on the edge of Comanche County, roughly 4 days' ride from town. The wagon would carry some dry goods, and a woman named Nora Brenner, who had arranged through correspondence to marry the ranch's owner, a man named Gerald Aldridge, whom Wallace had never met but had heard spoken of in the manner men speak of powerful figures they slightly fear. Wallace had loaded the wagon at dawn, stacking sacks of flour and cornmeal and crates of dry goods behind the seat, and he had been cinching the canvas tie-down when she came walking down the main street of Caldwell with a single leather traveling bag in her hand, and a look on her face that Wallace would spend the next 4 days trying to properly understand. Nora Brenner was 24 years old, and she was not at all what he had expected, though he realized afterward that he had not been sure what he expected. She was tall for a woman of that era, with dark auburn hair pinned firmly beneath a practical gray bonnet, and she had the kind of eyes that were difficult to categorize because they shifted depending on the light, sometimes brown, sometimes a deep amber, sometimes something closer to green. She was not wearing a traveling dress that suggested wealth, which struck him as notable given that she was heading toward a prosperous ranch, but rather a sensible dark skirt and a cream-colored blouse with a collar, buttoned all the way to the throat despite the warmth of the morning. She carried herself with a deliberate composure that Wallace recognized immediately as the specific posture of a person who is frightened and determined not to show it. She introduced herself without extending her hand, which was practical in the circumstances. "Nora Brenner," she said. "You are the driver." "Wallace Talbot," he said. "I am." She looked at the wagon, then at the horse, a steady gray gelding named Porter, then back at Wallace with an expression of careful assessment. "4 days," Mr. Heller said. "If the weather holds and we do not lose a wheel," Wallace confirmed. He offered his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. She took it briefly and settled herself on the bench with her bag on her lap, sitting very straight, looking south down the long flat road as if she were reading something written in the distance that only she could see. Wallace climbed up beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked Porter forward into the morning. For the first hour, neither of them spoke a single word. This was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was weighted, the way silence in a small space always becomes weighted when two strangers are pressed together by proximity and circumstance. Wallace watched the road. Nora watched the horizon. The wagon creaked steadily over the packed dirt, and Porter's hooves made their rhythmic percussion against the earth, and the wind moved through the tall grass on either side of the trail with a sound like something breathing slowly. It was Nora who broke the silence first. "Have you been to the Aldridge Ranch before?" she asked. "No," Wallace said. "I know the road south well enough. Never had occasion to stop at that particular place." "Do you know anything about it?" Wallace considered his answer. He knew a few things, none of them the kind a man volunteers to a woman about to become the mistress of the place. He knew that Gerald Aldridge was a man of 47 or 48, that he had come to Kansas from somewhere in the East with significant capital, and had built his operation through a combination of hard work and a willingness to deal in ways that other ranchers found expedient to overlook. He knew that Aldridge's first wife had died some years back, and that the ranch was a productive and isolated place. He knew that Aldridge was the sort of man whose name made room for itself in conversation without being invited. "It is a large operation," Wallace said carefully. "Cattle mostly, well established." Nora nodded once, as though confirming something she had already known. "Did Mr. Heller say anything about Mr. Aldridge?" "He said he was a man of means and a regular client." Another nod. Silence gathered again around them. Wallace watched the road and let it settle. It was another 2 hours before Nora spoke again, and when she did, her voice had shifted slightly in register, the way a person's voice changes when they stop making conversation and start actually talking. "I'm not from Kansas," she said. "Where are you from?" Wallace asked. "Ohio, a small town called Grafton. My father died in January." She said this with the careful flatness of someone who has repeated a difficult fact often enough that they can say it without flinching. "He left debts. I had a brother, but he went west 2 years ago, and we have not had a letter in 8 months. I answered an advertisement in the Cincinnati Enquirer placed by a matrimonial agency in Wichita. Mr. Aldridge's proposal was the most financially secure." Wallace absorbed this information quietly. He did not offer sympathy because he sensed she was not asking for it, but he felt the weight of it settle somewhere in his chest, the specific gravity of a person reduced by circumstance to making the best available choice from a very limited selection. "I expect it will suit well enough," he said, because it was a neutral thing to say. Nora turned to look at him directly for the first time. Her amber-brown eyes were steady and entirely without pretense. "Do you really?" she asked. Wallace met her gaze for a moment, then returned his attention to the road. "I do not know," he admitted. She seemed to appreciate the honesty. She turned back to the horizon, and some small fraction of the rigid composure in her shoulders eased, almost imperceptibly. They stopped at midday near a shallow creek where cottonwood trees made a pocket of shade, and Wallace unhitched Porter to water him while Nora produced from her bag a small wrapped parcel of bread and cold bacon, and ate with the neat efficiency of a person accustomed to making do. Wallace ate his own provisions sitting a respectful distance away on a flat boulder, watching the creek move over its stones in the bright noon light. "You are not much of a talker," Nora observed from across the small camp they had made. "No," Wallace agreed. "Neither am I, usually," she said. "I find I have become more talkative since January. I think it is because when everything changes at once, you feel the need to keep explaining it to yourself out loud, and sometimes you accidentally say it to whoever is nearby." Wallace looked at her. The sunlight came through the cottonwood leaves in shifting patches and landed across her face and the crown of her bonnet, and she was looking at the creek with an expression of such open, unguarded tiredness that something in Wallace's chest shifted in a way he could not immediately name. "That seems like a reasonable thing to do," he said. She looked at him then, and she almost smiled. It did not quite arrive, that smile, but the possibility of it was visible in the slight softening around the corners of her mouth and in the brief warmth that moved through those changeable eyes. They made good time that afternoon, covering nearly 14 miles before the light began to lower, and Wallace found a suitable campsite near a stand of oak scrub with good grass for Porter and a sheltered hollow where a fire would not draw attention. He built a small fire with practiced efficiency, while Nora unpacked the cooking provisions Frank Heller had included in the supplies, and she made a simple supper of salt pork and cornbread in the iron skillet, with a quiet competence that told Wallace she had been cooking over fires before, that she was not a woman entirely unacquainted with hard conditions. They ate with the fire between them and the vast Kansas sky overhead, which had turned by then to a deep purple blue in the east while the west still held the last bronze of the sun, and the first stars were appearing with the tentative brightness of things just waking. "Do you do this often?" Nora asked. "Drive women to ranches?" "Not especially," Wallace said. "I take whatever work comes through Hellers, freight mostly, supply runs. Sometimes I work the cattle drives in the fall." "Is that a good life?" Wallace stoked the fire with a stick and considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "It is a free life," he said finally. "Whether it is a good one depends on what you value." "What do you value?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled and Porter shifted in the grass somewhere behind him. "Honesty," he said. "An open country, and work that makes sense when you can see the result of it at the end of the day." Nora was watching him with that careful, assessing look she had, the look that had nothing unkind in it, simply the focused attention of an intelligent person trying to understand something. "Those are good things to value," she said. "What do you value?" he asked, because it seemed fair to return the question. She was quiet longer than he had been. The fire moved between them, orange and gold. "Safety," she said at last, and the word was simple and entirely honest and carried inside it the specific weight of someone who has known what it is to lack the thing they are naming. "And kindness, and something to do that feels purposeful." She paused. "And I used to value the sound of my father's voice reading aloud in the evenings. He read to us every night, even when we were grown. Dickens mostly, and some of the nature journals of John Muir." She stopped herself, seeming to hear how personal this had become. "I apologize. I told you I have become overly talkative." "Don't apologize," Wallace said quietly. She looked at him across the fire, and in the orange light her eyes were entirely amber, warm and steady, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. But the silence between them had changed its quality entirely from what it had been that morning. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was something else, something Wallace could not precisely name, though he was aware of it with his whole body, the way you become aware of a change in weather before you can see it. He told her he would take the first watch, that the country was generally safe, but that it was sensible to be careful. And she agreed without argument and spread her bedroll on the far side of the fire and was asleep within 20 minutes, or at least had the courtesy to appear so. Wallace sat with his back against an oak, his rifle across his knees, watching the fire burn low and the stars multiply overhead in their impossible thousands. And he thought about what she had said and felt the $15 in his vest pocket and wondered, for the first time, though not the last, whether he had the right sense of what he was being paid to do. The second day on the trail began cloudy, the sky sealed over with a low gray lid that turned the prairie flat and monochrome, and the wind came up from the southwest, carrying the smell of rain. Wallace watched it with the experienced eye of a man who has spent years reading weather off the land, and he did not like what he read. "We will push hard this morning," he told Nora when she came back from the creek where she had washed her face, her hair still pinned precisely under the gray bonnet, her composure entirely restored by sleep, "and try to reach the Hennessy station before the storm comes in." She climbed onto the wagon seat without question, and they moved out at a brisk pace, Porter responding well to the cooler air, and for a time they made excellent progress. The country was changing as they moved south, the flat open grassland beginning to roll in long gentle swells, and the trail threading between creek beds lined with cottonwood and willow, and the whole world smelling of green things and coming rain. Nora had brought a small book from her bag, a slim volume that Wallace could not see the title of, and she read for part of the morning with the book held carefully against the wagon's movement, though she set it down whenever the trail grew rough. "What are you reading?" he asked mid-morning when curiosity got the better of the reserve he tried to maintain. She showed him the cover. It was a copy of Middlemarch by George Eliot, worn at the spine and with a small piece of ribbon marking the page. "Have you read it?" she asked. "No," he said. "I have read some, not that. My father gave it to me for Christmas 2 years ago." She smoothed her hand over the cover in a gesture that was automatic and entirely unself-conscious, the kind of gesture you make with objects that carry weight beyond their material form. He wrote in the front, "Do not stop reading it on my account," Wallace said. "I was not," she said simply, and opened it again, and for the next hour they traveled in a comfortable quiet that was entirely different from the morning before, the silence of two people at ease rather than strangers managing their distance. The storm came faster than Wallace had hoped. By 11 o'clock, the wind had strengthened considerably, and the first heavy drops began to fall, widely spaced at first, striking the canvas cover of the wagon with hard, flat sounds. And then all at once the sky opened with the particular violence that Kansas storms have in spring, driving rain that came nearly horizontal, soaking everything within minutes. Wallace pushed Porter as fast as was safe, the road turning slick and uncertain beneath them, and Nora pressed close to his side by the narrowness of the wagon seat and held her bonnet down with one hand and said nothing, which Wallace found he admired considerably. They made the Hennessy station, which was a combination trading post and way station run by a couple named Art and Della Hennessy, just as the storm reached its full fury, and Wallace drove Porter under the roof of the Linta stable and secured him with trembling hands, because the cold rain had come on so fast and he was soaked through. And then he helped Nora down from the wagon, and they ran together through the deluge to the trading post door. And Art Hennessy let them in and gave them dry blankets and set them near the stove. Della Hennessy, who was a stout and practical woman of perhaps 55 with kind eyes and an entirely unsentimental manner, brought them hot coffee in tin cups and looked at the two of them with the specific assessment of a woman who has seen a great many travelers come through her station. "Married?" she asked. "No," Nora said, and then, because she was honest, "I am traveling to the Aldridge Ranch, to marry Mr. Aldridge." Della Hennessy received this information with a brief, controlled expression that shifted and settled before Wallace could entirely read it. She refilled his coffee without being asked. "Long ride yet," she said simply. 2 days at least." "Yes," Nora agreed. The storm kept them at the Hennessy station until late afternoon, and in that time Wallace found small repairs to make on the wagon harness while Nora helped Della in the kitchen. And through the single window of the trading post, he could sometimes see them moving together in the kitchen space, Nora's tall form beside Della's stouter one, the two of them talking with the easy efficiency of women who have both spent their lives making do with what is available. He watched this longer than he needed to, and then he went back to the harness work. When the rain eased, they took supper together at the Hennessy's table, all 4 of them, and Art Hennessy talked about the state of the trails south and the spring grass and the number of cattle drives expected to come through that season. And Wallace listened and contributed where he had something useful to add. At some point during the meal, Nora mentioned casually that she had studied at a normal school in Ohio for a year before her father's illness had required her to come home, that she had wanted to teach. The table went quiet for a moment in that particular way it does, when a person accidentally reveals the distance between what they hoped for and where they have arrived. "You could still teach," Della Hennessy said with gentle practicality. "These ranch communities always need teachers." Nora smiled, a real smile this time, not the almost smile from the creek the day before, but an actual one, brief and warm and a little sad. "Perhaps," she said. Wallace looked at his plate. That night, sleeping in the dry warmth of the Hennessy station's back room on a real cot, he lay awake for a long time listening to the rain that had softened to a steady whisper on the roof, and he thought about a great many things in the thorough, methodical way he had of thinking, working through them the way a carpenter works through a difficult join, turning it this way, and that until it makes sense. He thought about the $15 in his pocket and what it represented. He thought about Gerald Aldridge, whom he had never met but could construct a fairly complete picture of from what he knew, and what he had seen in Della Hennessy's controlled expression. He thought about Nora Brenner reading Middlemark against the movement of the wagon with one hand on her book and the other holding her bonnet in the rain. He thought about the word safety, spoken simply across a dying fire, and what it meant when a person named that as their primary value. He did not reach any conclusions that night. He only acknowledged to himself, with the honesty he had named as his own primary value, that the simple job he had taken had somehow, in the space of 2 days, become something considerably more complicated, and that this was something he would need to attend to carefully. The third day was the most beautiful of the journey. The storm had washed the world clean overnight and left behind it the kind of morning that feels like an argument for the existence of grace, the air crystalline and smelling of wet grass and earth, the sky a blazing empty blue, every color in the landscape intensified as though seen for the first time. The trail south was muddy in places, and Wallace picked their way carefully, keeping to the grass verge where the ground was firmer, and Porter walked steadily through the bright morning with his gray coat still slightly damp from the previous day, and his ears tilted forward with what Wallace had always privately interpreted as curiosity. Nora had left off the bonnet that morning for the first time. She had her auburn hair still pinned up properly, but without the gray felt over it, and the morning light on her face was something that Wallace found it difficult to look at directly without some disturbance to his composure, so he mostly looked at the trail. They talked more easily on the third day, as travelers do when the strangeness of shared proximity has worn away, and what remains is something more genuine. Nora told him about Grafton, Ohio, about the main street and the Methodist church and the small brick schoolhouse where she had first loved reading, about her father who had been a cabinet maker and a reader, and a gentle man reduced at the end by debt and illness to a shadow of himself, and how it had felt to watch that happen, and how it had shaped in her a conviction that dependency, financial dependency in particular, was a form of suffering she would work very hard to prevent in her own life. She said this last part with a slight irony that was not lost on either of them, given that she was riding toward a marriage to a man she had never met for reasons that were largely financial. "I know how it looks," she said, "like the very thing I said I would avoid." "It looks like a person making the best choice available," Wallace said. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. The question was the same one she had asked on the first morning, whether he really believed it would suit well enough, and she asked it in the same way, directly and without artifice, genuinely wanting to know. Wallace was quiet for a stretch of trail, watching the landscape to the south where the land broke in long, gentle ridges, and the spring grass ran in waves of green. "I believe that the circumstances that brought you to this choice were not fair ones," he said at last. "And I believe that you have more courage than most people I have encountered, which is not nothing." Nora turned to look at him, and he felt her looking, felt the quality of it, the careful way she examined things when she was trying to understand them. "What brought you to this?" she asked after a moment. "To driving wagons and working cattle drives." He was quiet again. This was a thing he did, she had noticed, took real time before answering questions that mattered, not from evasiveness but from a kind of respect for the question, treating it seriously enough to give it proper thought. She found this, she had realized sometime in the last day, deeply unusual and deeply appealing. "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "My father worked a small farm. It was a reasonable life, not easy but reasonable. When I was 17, the farm went under. A combination of bad seasons and a debt my father had not managed to keep ahead of. We lost it in the spring of '72. He paused. "My father went back to Missouri's lead mines and my mother went to live with her sister in St. Louis, and I went west because that seemed like the direction a person went when the ground had been taken from under them. I have been in Kansas since '73. "Do you ever want a place of your own again?" Nora asked. "Land, a farm or a ranch?" The question landed precisely on the thing he thought about in the quiet hours, the thing that drove the careful economy with which he lived, the dollars he added to the small savings he kept at the bank in Caldwell, the steady accumulation towards something he had not yet been able to clearly name. "Yes," he said simply. "I thought so," Nora said, not unkindly, and turned back to the trail. Around midday they stopped near a wide, slow-moving creek, where the banks were lush with new grass, and the water was still running high and slightly tawny from the rain. They watered Porter and ate their noon provisions in a companionable quiet, and then, without particular planning, both of them sat on the grassy bank with their boots off and their feet near the water, not in it, just near it, in the warm April sun, and Nora read aloud from Middlemark for a while, her voice steady and clear, and with the slight musicality of a person who genuinely loves the language they are reading. Wallace listened with his eyes half closed and the sun on his face, and felt something he had not felt in a long time, possibly years, possibly ever in quite this form, a sense of being precisely where he was supposed to be. It was a disorienting feeling given the circumstances, and he did not trust it, but it was there. "You read well," he said when she paused. "Thank you. My father used to say that reading aloud was a form of hospitality." She closed the book and held it in her lap, sharing what you love by letting other people inhabit it. "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man." He was. Her voice was steady, but her hands tightened slightly on the book. "He was kind in a way that cost him nothing to be kind, if you understand what I mean. He did not have to work at it. It was simply his nature. I have found that to be quite rare." They looked at the water moving past, amber and clear by turns over the stones. "I think you are like that," Nora said quietly, and she was looking at the creek when she said it, not at him. Wallace did not respond immediately. He sat with the words and felt them do something inside his chest, something warm and significant and slightly alarming. "I think you are generous," he said finally. She looked at him then, turned her full face toward him in the bright afternoon sun, and for a long, suspended moment they simply looked at each other, and the air between them was dense with something that neither of them had named, and both of them understood perfectly. And then Nora looked back at the creek, and Wallace began putting on his boots, and they did not speak about it. But it was there between them now, like a stone they had both placed and could not take back. That third afternoon, as they moved deeper into the rolling country of southern Kansas, and the trail grew narrower and less traveled, they began to talk about things that people do not usually discuss with someone they have known for 3 days. They talked about loneliness and what form it takes, not the simple loneliness of physical isolation, but the subtler kind that lives inside the gap between who you are and how you are seen by the people around you. They talked about fear and how it shapes decision-making, how the fear of repeating a specific pain can lead a person straight into a different form of the same thing. They talked about hope, what it looks like when it is reasonable and what it looks like when it is simply stubbornness wearing hope's clothes. At one point, somewhere in the long, rolling, golden afternoon, Nora said, "Tell me something true about yourself that you have not told anyone in a long time." Wallace turned this over carefully. "I keep a small notebook," he said. "I write things in it, observations, things I notice, the way weather looks when it is about to change, the way a particular section of prairie looks at a specific time of day, sometimes things people say that seem important." He paused. "I have never told anyone that." Nora was looking at him with that warm, careful look. "Why not?" "Because it seems like the kind of thing that invites a response I would not know what to do with." "What sort of response?" He looked at her. "Like the one you are having right now," he said quietly. She did not deny that she was having a response. She looked away first this time, out at the rolling golden land, and he could see the line of her jaw and the angle of her throat and the way she held herself with a composure that was, he had come to understand, not coldness but a form of care, the way a person holds something precious very steadily so they do not drop it. "What did you put in it today?" she asked. "If you wrote today." He thought about this honestly. "The way the creek sounded when you were reading," he said, "and the color of the light right now." Nora Brenner smiled, And this time it was neither the almost smile of the first evening nor the brief sad smile at the Hennessy table, but something new, something full and warm and slightly helpless, the smile of a person feeling something they had not prepared for, and it was the most entirely beautiful thing Wallace Talbot had ever seen, and he looked away from it because he had to look away from it, because if he did not look away from it, he was not sure what he would do. They made camp that night in a hollow between two low ridges, sheltered from the wind, and the night was clear and cold and brilliant with stars, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire as they had from the first night, but the fire between them felt different now, not a division but a center, something they were both organized around. "How far tomorrow?" Nora asked. "We will reach Aldridge's land by mid-afternoon if we start early," Wallace said. "The ranch house itself is perhaps 2 hours' ride past the boundary." Nora received this with a nod, looking at the fire. In the orange light her face was entirely still, and he could not read what was behind the stillness, whether it was acceptance or resignation or something else, and this inability to read her precisely for the first time in 3 days created in him a sharp, specific anxiety. "Are you afraid?" he asked, and then was surprised to have said it because it was not the kind of question he asked people. She looked at him across the fire and her eyes were very steady. "Yes," she said. "What are you afraid of?" "Of arriving somewhere that looked like safety and finding that it is not." She held his gaze. "I have made decisions based on incomplete information before." When you are afraid and limited in options, it is easy to weight the positive indications too heavily and ignore the ones that give you pause. "What gives you pause about Aldridge?" Wallace asked. He was asking directly now without the cushioning indirection he usually employed because they were past that. Nora was quiet for a moment. "His letters were correct," she said finally. "Entirely correct in every sense, perfectly polite, appropriately formal. They told me a great deal about the ranch, and almost nothing about the man. And I have found in my experience that when a person's correspondence tells you only what they want you to know and nothing that has escaped their control, the gap between what they present and what they are can be considerable." Wallace stared at the fire. He thought about what he knew of Gerald Aldridge, the things he had not said on the first morning because they were not his to say, and he felt the weight of them differently now. "What did you hear about him in Caldwell?" Nora asked quietly. "Before we left." "What do people say?" He looked at her. She was watching him with those steady, direct eyes, and she was not asking to be frightened further. He understood that she was asking because she needed true information and she had identified him correctly as the most honest source she had. "He is known as a man who gets what he intends to get," Wallace said carefully. "He is spoken of as hard but fair in business dealings." He paused. "He is not known as a man of warmth." Nora absorbed this. She nodded slowly, a single deep nod that said she had understood more than he had said directly. "And you," she said after a long silence, her voice very quiet, "what will you do when you have delivered me?" The word delivered landed between them with an ugly weight neither of them had expected. It was the right word technically, the accurate word for what the job described, and yet hearing it out loud in this fire-lit hollow at the end of 3 days that had become something neither of them had planned for, it was a word that fit badly. "Ride back to Caldwell," Wallace said. "Take the next job Heller has." Nora looked at the fire. The flames had dropped to coals, mostly orange and red and alive. The silence stretched. "I should sleep," she said at last. "Yes," he said. She stood and smoothed her skirt and did not look at him before she went to her bedroll, and he sat up keeping watch for a long time, feeding the fire small pieces of wood and watching the coals and not writing in his notebook, though he had it in his shirt pocket as always, because there were things tonight that he could not find the proper words for, and he had too much respect for precision to write them badly. The 4th day. Wallace woke before dawn with a cold, clear head and the specific quality of knowing, the way you sometimes wake knowing something you had not consciously decided while asleep. He built up the fire and heated the coffee and stood with the cup warming his hands, watching the sky go from black to gray to the first pale edge of light in the east, and he knew two things with absolute certainty. The first was that he was in love with Nora Brenner in the direct, uncomplicated way a person falls in love when they are paying genuine attention to another person, and that person is genuinely remarkable. The second was that delivering her to Gerald Aldridge's ranch was the wrong thing to do. He wrestled with the second of these throughout the long, slow dawn, not because he was uncertain about its truth, but because the implications were serious and many-faceted, and he was a careful man. He was being paid to do a job. Nora had made a legal arrangement, a marriage contract through a legitimate agency. She was a grown woman of sound mind who had made her own decision. What right did he have to complicate that, or to assume he understood better than she did what was good for her? He was a $30 a month hired hand with a notebook and a nearly broken-down wagon. He had nothing to offer her except his own impoverished honesty and the $15 in his vest pocket that he would not, he realized, be able to accept. But there was what she had said, the fear, the assessment of Aldridge's letters, the specific and considered intelligence of a woman who had identified clearly the nature of what she was walking toward and was going anyway because she believed she had no better option. And there was what he felt, which he was not going to perform as though it were her salvation. He was not going to walk into this with the arrogance of a man who assumes his feelings entitle him to override another person's choices. That was not what he was. But he was going to tell the truth. Whatever else happened, he was going to tell the truth. Nora woke shortly after dawn and came to the fire, and she poured herself coffee and stood beside him in the golden rose morning light, and they looked south at the land that was about to deliver them to the edge of Aldridge's property, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "I did not sleep well." "Nor did I," he said. They looked at each other. "Wallace," she said, and she said his name, his given name. For the first time, she had called him Mr. Talbot until now, and the sound of it in her voice was something he felt in his entire chest. "What are we doing?" He set down his coffee cup carefully on a flat stone near the fire. He turned to face her fully, and he was as serious as he had ever been in his life. "I need to tell you some things," he said, "and then I need you to tell me what you want to do, not what you have arranged to do or what you came out here planning to do, what you actually want." Nora set down her own cup. She stood very straight in the cold morning light, her auburn hair not yet pinned for the day, loose around her shoulders, and she looked at him with the full force of those remarkable eyes, and she said, "Tell me." He told her what he knew about Gerald Aldridge. He told her carefully and specifically, the things Heller had let slip in conversation over the years, the whispered reputation of a man who had buried his first wife in a remarkably short span of years, leaving a brief official account of a fever and a longer unofficial account that people told only in lowered voices. He told her about Aldridge's dealings with the smaller ranchers to his south, the way properties had a tendency to come available when Aldridge was looking to expand, the way men who owed Aldridge money sometimes found their situations becoming untenable in ways that could not quite be traced back to any one cause. He told her that none of this was proven, that a man was not his reputation, but that he had been sitting on this information for 3 days, and that the longer he sat on it, the more it pressed against everything he valued. Nora listened without interrupting, standing very still with her hands clasped in front of her. When he finished, she was quiet for the long, specific silence of someone processing information that confirmed something they had already feared. "Why did you not tell me this on the first day?" she asked. Her voice was entirely even. "Because on the first day you were a stranger making a decision that was yours to make," he said. "And because I was not sure enough to speak without being more certain you needed to hear it. And now," he held her gaze, "now I am certain." Nora turned and walked a short distance away, to the edge of the hollow where the ground rose slightly, and from which she could see a long way south, the rolling land in its morning colors. He watched her stand there for what felt like a long time but was perhaps 2 minutes. The morning light was full gold now. the kind of light that makes everything clear, and he watched her and waited. When she turned back to face him, her expression was the most open he had seen it, the composure laid down, not abandoned but set aside like a tool she no longer needed for this particular task. "I am terrified," she said. "Not of Aldridge. I mean, yes, of Aldridge, but more of this." She gestured between them, a small but entirely clear gesture. "Of this being the thing I chose based on 3 days of very unusual circumstances that may not constitute any sort of reliable evidence." "That is a reasonable fear," Wallace said. "You are not making this easier." "I do not know how to make it easier and still be honest." She looked at him for a long moment, and then something happened in her expression. Something broke open in it in the best possible way, like a window coming unlatched. "Last night you said you had never told anyone about the notebook," she said. "Yes. I want to be the person you tell things to," she said. "I am terrified, and I am still in the middle of a decision I made when I thought I had no better options. And I know you cannot promise me anything because you are a hired hand with $15 and a borrowed wagon. And none of that matters as much as it should because I want to be the person you tell things to. And I think you want that too." Wallace Talbot, who was not a man of large gestures or dramatic declarations, who valued precision and honesty, and the kind of care that shows itself through consistent small acts rather than grand performances, took 2 steps across the hollow and stood directly in front of Nora Brenner and said, very quietly, "Yes." She reached out her hand and he took it, and they stood in the gold morning light holding hands like 2 people who have just found solid ground after a long swim, and the relief of it was enormous for both of them, enormous and frightening and entirely real. "I am not delivering you to Aldridge's ranch," he said. "No," she agreed. "You are not." "I need to think about what comes next," he said. "Practically, there will be consequences. The agency arrangement, the contract, Aldridge himself will not simply accept a breach." "I know," Nora said. She was still holding his hand and her grip was firm and steady. "I know, and I am not asking you to solve it for me. I am asking you to help me think." And so they sat down together at the fire, side by side for the first time on this journey rather than across from each other, and they thought together, which was, Wallace discovered, the most natural and pleasurable activity he had ever engaged in with another person. The first practical matter was Aldridge. He would know Nora had traveled from Caldwell, because Heller had arranged the transport and Aldridge had paid for it through the agency. When she did not arrive, he would inquire. When it became clear that Wallace had taken the wagon and not delivered her, there would be a demand for the return of the transport fee and potentially more serious complaints. Wallace considered this with the methodical calm that served him in difficult situations. The transport fee was $8, paid to Heller. The $8 was a problem he could address, and he would. The more complicated question was the marriage contract itself. Nora had entered into it through a legitimate matrimonial agency in Wichita. The contract had a release provision, she told him. She had read it carefully, which required 30 days' notice and the return of any expenses incurred by the prospective husband in connection with the arrangement. Aldridge had paid the agency's introductory fee, which had been $15. The agency would have some of this. The remainder would need to be returned. "The $15 for driving you," Wallace said. "I am not keeping it. We will use it toward the contract release." Nora looked at him steadily. "You need that money." "I need to be able to look at myself clearly in a mirror," he said simply. "I need that more." She was quiet for a moment. "All right." The second practical matter was where they were going. They could not return to Caldwell immediately, because Heller was Aldridge's agent in this matter and would be obligated to report to him, and Wallace wanted to be further along in resolving the official complications before that conversation happened. He had a cousin, he told Nora, a man named Samuel Talbot who ran a modest but stable horse breeding operation up near the town of Medicine Lodge, roughly a day and a half north of their current position. Samuel was a man of considerable discretion and no particular affection for Gerald Aldridge, and he had a wife named Catherine who was, by all accounts, one of the more practical and kind human beings Wallace had encountered, and they had room. "You are asking your family to take in a stranger," Nora said. "My cousin owes me 3 years' worth of kindness," Wallace said, "and I think you will not long be a stranger to anyone who meets you." He said this matter-of-factly, not with the tone of a compliment, and it landed on Nora with the particular force that honest assessments carry, a force much greater than any studied flattery. They broke camp with an efficiency born of 4 days' practice, Wallace striking the fire and packing the provisions while Nora rolled the bedrolls and secured the wagon. Porter accepted being hitched with his usual equanimity, shaking his gray mane in the gold morning, and within an hour they had turned the wagon north, away from the rolling southern country and Aldridge's land, and the whole trajectory that had been set for Nora's life by grief and limited options, and were moving back through the spring morning with the wide sky above them, and the grass on both sides running in green waves to the horizon. Nora sat beside him on the wagon seat in the morning light, and she was not quite smiling, because the situation was too serious and too uncertain for simple smiling, but she was looking at the northward road with an expression he had not seen on her before, something that was either hope or the very first emergence of it, fragile and new as the spring grass. "Are you afraid?" he asked, returning the question she had asked him the night before. "Yes," she said, "but differently than before." She paused. "Before I was afraid of arriving somewhere. Now I am afraid of the open space ahead, and that is a better kind of fear." "It is," he agreed. She reached across and put her hand briefly on his arm, a light touch, and then withdrew it, and they both looked at the road, and Wallace thought that if he lived to be a very old man in a rocking chair on a porch somewhere, he would remember this moment, the morning light and the green grass and the wagon going north and the weight of that brief touch on his arm, and the feeling of a life rearranging itself around something true. They rode hard through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest Porter and eat, and by the time the shadows were lengthening, they had covered a significant distance, and the country had shifted from the rolling southern plains back toward the more varied landscape of central Kansas. Wallace knew this country well, had worked it for 6 years, and he navigated by landmarks and the slant of the light with the relaxed confidence of long familiarity. As the sun descended toward the western horizon, painting the sky in the extraordinary colors that the Kansas plains produce in the evening, all gold and coral and a deep burning orange, Nora turned to him and said, very simply, as if she had been holding it since the first day and had only just now decided to release it, "I am glad I asked your name." Wallace looked at her in the dying light, and she was turned toward him in profile first, watching the sunset, and then she turned fully to face him, and the golden light was across her face, and her eyes were the most astonishing amber in this light, warm and deep and entirely his. "When?" he asked, though he knew. "The first day," she said. "At sundown. I asked your name and you told me, and something settled in me that had not been settled in a very long time. I could not understand it then. I understand it now." He looked at her for a long, full moment, the kind of moment that has weight and permanence to it, that a person can return to in memory for the rest of their life and find unchanged. "Nora," he said, just her name, quietly. "Yes," she said, just as quietly. He leaned across the seat and he kissed her, gently and precisely, in the way he did all things of importance, and she kissed him back in the way she did all things of importance, with her whole, undivided attention, and the wagon rolled to a stop because he had let the reins go slack, and Porter obligingly halted in the middle of the trail and turned his gray head to look at some distant point of interest while his driver engaged in activities unrelated to forward motion. When they separated, they were both quietly breathless, looking at each other in the last light of the day with expressions that were twin versions of the same thing, astonishment and recognition, and a happiness so new it was slightly painful. "We should keep moving," Wallace said, his voice not quite its usual steadiness. Yes, Nora agreed, her voice similarly affected. Porter resumed forward motion without being asked, as though he had been waiting patiently for exactly this resolution, and now considered it his responsibility to make practical progress. They reached a small settlement called Rideout's Crossing as the dark was fully settling. A handful of buildings around a crossroads, including a small hotel that was more accurately a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Prater, who had white hair and a sharp eye, and asked no questions beyond the practical ones involving payment and the time they planned to depart in the morning. Wallace paid for 2 separate rooms, which he could barely afford, and this did not go unnoticed by Nora, who looked at him with something in her expression that he could only describe as seeing him completely. They ate supper at the boarding house table with Mrs. Prater and 2 other travelers, a hardware salesman from Wichita and a homesteading couple named Kowalski, who were moving their family further west, and had the specific exhausted determination on their faces of people who have committed to a course and intend to see it through regardless of difficulty. Nora spoke kindly to Mrs. Kowalski about the journey and the children, who ate quickly and asked if they could be excused, and Wallace watched her be warm and real and interested in the people at the table, and thought about what Della Hennessy had said about the ranch communities always needing teachers. After supper they sat on the boarding house porch in the dark, side by side in 2 wooden chairs, and the night was cool and the stars were extraordinary, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence Wallace had ever inhabited with another person. "What are we going to do?" Nora asked, not in the frightened way she might have asked it yesterday, but in the way 2 people ask it when they have decided they are a we and are now addressing the practical logistics of that fact. "We get to Samuel's," Wallace said. "I write to the matrimonial agency in Wichita and inform them of the situation, and arrange the release of the contract and return Aldridge's agency fee. I expect Aldridge will be angry. He is a man of pride and this will wound that, but a marriage contract is not an indenture. A woman who has not yet married is not bound in law to complete the arrangement, and the agency will have handled this before. They will not be pleased, but they will manage it. And Heller, I will repay him the transport cost from my savings. I owe him for using the wagon outside the agreed-upon purpose. He will be disgruntled, but Heller is a fair man at bottom. He will not carry it further than a financial complaint. And after all of that," Nora said quietly, "what then?" Wallace turned to look at her in the darkness, and she was looking at the stars with that quality she had of being entirely present while also appearing to be looking at something far away. "I have about $340 saved," he said. "I have been working toward land, a small claim, somewhere with good grass and water. I am not in a position to offer much, Nora. I want to be honest with you about that. I am not a man of means." She turned to look at him then, and her face in the starlight was entirely serious and entirely soft at the same time. "I did not ask what you have," she said. "I asked what then." He held her gaze. "Then I would like to court you properly," he said, "with whatever time and proper conduct that requires. And if at the end of it you are willing, I would like to build something with you. The kind of something you were describing when you told me what you value, safety and kindness and purposeful work. I cannot promise anything beyond the intention, but the intention is entirely genuine." Nora was quiet for a long moment, looking at him in the starlight. When she spoke, her voice was very steady and very clear. "I have been courted before," she said. "In Grafton, by 2 different men, both perfectly adequate. And adequate is precisely what they were, and I could not bring myself to want adequate." She paused. "You asked me on the first night what I value, and I said safety. But I left things out because I did not know you well enough to say them. I also value being known. Being genuinely known by another person, not the version of yourself you present, but the actual self, the one that keeps a notebook and the one that reads Dickens aloud on winter evenings. I want to be known by someone who is also genuinely known by me." She looked at him steadily. "I feel known by you, after 4 days. I know that sounds unreasonable. It sounds honest, Wallace said. Will you court me? She asked, and the directness of it, the unadorned, clear-eyed courage of asking the exact question rather than waiting to be asked, was so entirely in keeping with everything he knew of her that it made his heart contract with something so close to joy he could not distinguish them. Yes, he said, with every intention I have. She reached over in the dark and found his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she held it, and they sat on the porch in the starlight looking at Kansas above them, and both of them were slightly smiling in the way people smile when they are afraid and hopeful and alive in the specific manner that requires both of those things to be true simultaneously. The ride to Samuel Talbot's place took the next day and a half, moving north through the varied country of central Kansas, and during those 30-some hours, Wallace and Nora talked with the inexhaustible quality of two people who have found a conversation they do not want to end. They talked about everything they had not yet covered, her years at the normal school, the books she most loved and why, the way Ohio looked in the fall, and whether she missed it, and what it was she actually missed when she thought about it carefully. He told her about the cattle drives, the specific experience of weeks on horseback moving thousands of animals across open country, the way the land looked when it had not yet been divided and fenced, the way he feared it was disappearing faster than it should. They talked about the railroads and the changes coming to the territory and what it meant for the people who had come here first, a subject on which both of them had views that were more complicated and honest than the simple triumphalism he encountered in most political conversation of the era. The land was not empty when people arrived and decided to homestead it, Nora said, on the second morning of the ride, with the clear-eyed directness he had come to expect from her on difficult subjects. I know that is not a comfortable thing to say in the middle of a homestead region, but it is true, and ignoring true things does not make them less true. No, Wallace agreed, it does not. He had his own thoughts on this, shaped by years of working land that had been someone else's living space before it was anyone's property claim, by watching the results of policies that were spoken of in official language as civilizing, and were in practice something considerably darker. He did not expand on this at length because he did not have a solution to offer, and he had learned to be cautious about speaking at length on subjects for which he had only grief and no remedy. But he felt the alignment of their thinking on this the way he felt her hand in his, like something fitting properly where it was supposed to go. Samuel Talbot's horse farm appeared in the late afternoon of the 5th day since Caldwell, a modest but well-maintained operation on a rise above a good creek, with solid fencing and a barn that showed signs of recent and competent carpentry. Wallace pulled the wagon up the track to the main house, and a woman came out onto the porch before they had stopped, wiping her hands on an apron, and she was a small, quick-eyed woman of about 30 with light brown hair and the kind of direct, friendly manner that immediately makes a place feel like it belongs to someone warm. "Wallace Talbot," she said, with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "It has been nearly a year. Sam is in the south pasture, but he will be back before dark." She looked at Nora with undisguised curiosity and equal warmth. "And you must be someone important because Wallace does not bring people home." "Catherine," Wallace said, with the tone of a man slightly embarrassed by accuracy, "this is Nora Brenner. I will explain everything at supper." Catherine Talbot looked at Nora and then at Wallace and then back at Nora with the specific expression of a woman who has already understood the significant part and does not require the supper explanation to proceed with forming her welcome. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. The coffee is on." Samuel Talbot arrived from the pasture an hour later, a man several years older than Wallace, broader in the shoulders, with the same dark hair and the same quality of careful, unhurried attention, and he shook Wallace's hand and nodded to Nora, and listened to the whole account over supper with the attentive patience of a man who does not form opinions until he has sufficient information. When Wallace was done, Samuel refilled his coffee and was quiet for a moment. "The agency letter needs to go out tomorrow," Samuel said. "I can ride to Medicine Lodge with it." "I know," Wallace said. "I will write it tonight." "And Aldridge." Samuel set down his cup and looked at Wallace directly. "He will not simply accept this. $15 to the agency is nothing to a man like Aldridge. What he will not accept is the slight to his standing." "I know that too," Wallace said. "Then you need to be prepared for the possibility that he sends someone." "If he does," Wallace said quietly, "I will handle it." Nora had been listening to this exchange with the alert stillness she employed when taking in important information, and now she spoke. "I will write to the agency as well," she said. "My own letter, separate from Wallace's. I want it clear that the decision was mine, that I was not taken anywhere against my will or deceived. The decision was mine and I made it freely, and I take full responsibility for the breach of the arrangement." Samuel looked at her for a moment, and then something in his expression that had been slightly reserved became entirely open. "Good," he said simply, and that was all. Catherine put them in separate rooms, as a matter of the appropriate form, and before Nora went to bed that evening, she came to find Wallace where he was sitting at the kitchen table writing the agency letter by lamplight, and she stood behind him for a moment reading over his shoulder, which was so intimate a thing for a woman of her era and sensibility, to do that it made his hand pause on the page. "Tell them I was not coerced," she said quietly. "Tell them I asked to be released of my own will." "I am telling them exactly that," he said. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, a warm, deliberate pressure, and then went to bed, and Wallace finished the letter with the ghost of her hand still present on his shoulder, and felt that the sentence he was writing might be the most important sentence he had ever written. In the days that followed at the Talbot farm, a shape began to emerge for what the future might contain. Samuel sent the letters to Medicine Lodge to be dispatched, one to the matrimonial agency in Wichita, and one to Frank Heller in Caldwell with Wallace's repayment of the transport fee, and a clear account of what had occurred. Nora's separate letter went in the same dispatch, precise and composed and entirely unambiguous about the voluntary nature of her withdrawal from the arrangement. The response from the agency came back in 8 days, which was fast but not surprising given that these arrangements were business transactions first, and the agency was experienced in managing their termination. The letter was curt but not hostile. The contract was released. Aldridge's agency fee, less a processing charge, was to be returned to him. The matter, from the agency's perspective, was concluded. Nora read the letter at the kitchen table with Catherine beside her, and let out a single long, quiet breath that she seemed to have been holding since Ohio. The response from Aldridge himself came 3 days later, and it was not a letter but a man, a writer named Birch, who arrived at the Talbot farm gate and asked for Wallace Talbot, and delivered a message by word, as men of Aldridge's type often preferred for certain communications, that Aldridge expected compensation beyond the agency fee for the insult to his standing and his time, and that if this was not forthcoming, he would consider other means of satisfying the debt. Wallace listened to this message with his hands very still and his face entirely unreadable, which was a thing he could do when necessary, the absolute stillness of a man who is choosing not to let anything show. Samuel stood at his shoulder. Nora was in the house and had not come out, which was either courtesy or wisdom, probably both. "Tell Mr. Aldridge," Wallace said quietly, "that the lady withdrew from the arrangement freely and within the terms of the contract, and that this has been confirmed in writing by the agency. Tell him that any attempt to pursue this matter further, by any means, will be met with a full accounting of his business practices and personal history that I am prepared to give in the most public forums available in this territory. Tell him that I keep detailed records." The writer Birch was a practical man who had delivered unpleasant messages to unpleasant effect before and recognized the specific quality of a man who means exactly what he says. He left without additional discussion. Samuel watched the writer go, then looked at Wallace. Do you in fact keep detailed records on Aldridge? I keep a notebook, Wallace said, and I have a very good memory and a great deal of information I have collected over years of working this region. It is not a bluff. Samuel nodded slowly. I do not think he will push it, he said. Men like Aldridge calculate everything. The cost of pursuing this is higher than the benefit. He will find another arrangement and consider himself well rid of an inconvenient situation. He was right. No further communication came from Aldridge, and over the weeks that followed, as spring deepened into early summer and the Talbot farm moved through its seasonal rhythms, the shadow of Gerald Aldridge receded from Nora's daily life with the steady efficiency of a threat that has been properly faced and found to be, when faced directly, smaller than the fear it had generated. What grew in its place was considerable. Nora, in the first weeks at the Talbot farm, demonstrated with quiet persistence that she was not a person inclined to be a burden on others. She contributed to the household with an energy and competence that Catherine, who was not easily impressed, openly admired. She helped with the cooking and the kitchen garden and the mending, and she turned out to have a working knowledge of horses that surprised Samuel, who had not expected the former schoolteacher from Ohio to be comfortable around a 16-hand breeding stallion. She told him, with the slight smile she used for pleasantly confounding expectations, that her father had kept 2 horses and that she had been managing their care since she was 12 years old. She and Wallace courted with the particular quality of 2 people who have already had the essential conversation and are now filling in everything around it, which is perhaps the best kind of courtship, the kind in which both people know where they are going and are taking genuine pleasure in the journey rather than navigating the uncertainty of the destination. He took her walking along the creek in the evenings when the day's work was done, and they talked and were sometimes silent, and both things were equally good. He showed her his notebook, all of it, from the first entry 6 years back to the present, and she read it with the careful attention she gave to everything she valued, and returned it to him with an expression that was simply love, not the declared, formalized kind, but the kind that is already a settled fact and simply needed naming. He read to her from the few books he owned, a battered almanac and a volume of natural history, and a collection of poems by Longfellow that had belonged to his mother, and she listened with the quality of attention that makes a reader feel that what they are sharing has been genuinely received. She read to him from Middlemark in the evenings after supper, the 4 of them sometimes, she and Wallace and Samuel and Catherine, gathered around the lamp in the sitting room with the night sounds of the Kansas summer outside, and these evenings had about them the quality of something being built, a life taking its ordinary and extraordinary shape around people who have chosen each other. At the end of June, on a warm evening with the sun going down in brilliant color over the western fields and the creek running low and clear after a dry fortnight, Wallace took Nora walking along the water and stopped at a wide bend where a large cottonwood cast its evening shade over the bank, and he asked her to marry him. He did not make a speech. He was not a man of speeches. He said, "Nora, I love you, and I intend to spend my life being worthy of you, and I would like very much if you would marry me and let me try." She looked at him in the evening light, this man she had asked the name of at sundown on a dusty street in Caldwell 6 weeks earlier, this quiet, careful, honest man who kept a notebook and drove a wagon and kissed her in a way that felt like being understood, and she felt in her chest the same settling sensation she had felt that first day when he told her his name, but larger now, vast, the size of the Kansas sky. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Wallace. Yes." He put his arms around her and she held on, and the cottonwood moved in the evening wind above them, and the creek ran past below them, and the sky performed its nightly extravagance of color for an audience of 2 people who were too absorbed in each other to watch it properly, but would remember it perfectly for the rest of their lives. They were married in Medicine Lodge in August of 1879, a simple ceremony at the Methodist Church with Samuel and Catherine as witnesses, and the minister's wife as the only other person in attendance, because they wanted it to be exactly what it was, and nothing performed for an audience. Nora wore a dress of deep blue that Catherine had helped her make from fabric purchased at the Medicine Lodge General Store, and Wallace wore his good coat, and the one shirt that did not show significant trail wear, and they stood in front of the minister and said the words that were simple and old and true. And when he put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band he had saved for and purchased in Medicine Lodge 2 days before the ceremony. She looked at it on her hand, and then up at him, and her eyes were bright with something she did not call crying. Not quite. After the ceremony, they ate dinner at the best restaurant Medicine Lodge offered, which was a modest claim but a genuine one, and Samuel made a toast that was brief and sincere, and made Catherine press her lips together to manage her response. And then they went back to the Talbot farm for the remainder of the summer, while Wallace pursued the land claim he had been building toward. He found it in September, which was later in the season than was ideal for beginning, but early enough to do the groundwork before winter. It was a 160-acre claim under the Homestead Act in a section of country south and slightly west of Medicine Lodge, with a good creek running through the northern portion, and soil that Samuel, who knew the land, assessed as genuinely productive. There was no house on it yet, only the bare land in its autumn colors, but there was grass and water and the bones of something real. Wallace stood on his land on the September afternoon when the claim was finalized and felt in his body, a thing he had not felt since he was 16 years old, standing in a field in Missouri before it was lost, the feeling of ground that belongs to you, that your labor will transform and your presence has meaning on. He turned to Nora, who stood beside him in the afternoon light, and she was looking at the land with an expression of serious consideration, taking its measure. "What do you see?" he asked her. She turned to him and she smiled, the full warm smile that had undone him on the 3rd day of the trail. "Home," she said simply. Building it took the rest of the fall and the early winter, Wallace working the construction with help from Samuel and 2 neighboring homesteaders, Nora managing the logistics and the cooking for the work crew, and the beginning of the kitchen garden. She was already planning with a precision that impressed Wallace even now, when very little about her capacity failed to impress him. They moved into the house in December before it was entirely finished, because the winter had come in earnest and the Talbot farm, generous as Samuel and Catherine were, was not where they lived. This was where they lived, in the house that was not yet complete but was theirs. That first winter on their claim was the kind of winter that tests the truth of what people believe about themselves and each other. It was cold and sometimes lonely, and the work was relentless, and the nearest town was a significant ride away, and there were days when the limitations of their situation pressed heavily. But they had each other, which Wallace had never before understood to be the precise and practical resource that it turned out to be, having another person who is genuinely on your side, not in a decorative sense, but in the actual sense of working alongside you and thinking alongside you, and being present for the hard days as readily as for the good ones. In the evenings of that winter, they read to each other, alternating chapters from whatever book they had at hand, and talked about the land and the plans for spring and the future as they were building it. Nora wrote letters to her aunt in Ohio, a woman who had heard the account of the journey and the failed delivery and the marriage that had grown from it, and had responded with a warmth that Nora read aloud to Wallace, and that made them both laugh and feel loved from a distance. Wallace wrote occasionally to his mother in St. Louis, letters that were longer than they had ever been before because he finally had things to say that were genuinely good. In the early spring of 1880, Nora came to Wallace in the kitchen where he was studying a hand-drawn plan of the fields he intended to plant, and she stood in the doorway with a particular quality about her, a specific stillness that he had learned over the months to recognize as the stillness of someone who is holding something important. "I think we are expecting a child," she said. He stood up from the table immediately, knocking the chair back, and crossed the kitchen and took her face in his calloused hands and looked at her with everything he had, all of it plain on his face, the love and the wonder and the gratitude that was so large it was almost frightening. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she was smiling, the smile that was full and warm and entirely hers. "I am very well. Are you happy?" he asked. She put her hands over his where they held her face. "Wallace Talbot," she said, with the directness that had characterized everything she had ever said to him, "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life. Yes." He kissed her in the morning light of their kitchen, and outside the window the spring was coming up green through the brown of the winter-pressed grass, and the creek ran fast with snowmelt from the north. And Porter, old and gray in his pasture, lifted his head and looked at something in the middle distance with his ears tilted forward in apparent interest at whatever the new season was bringing. Their son was born in November of 1880, during the first early cold snap of the season when the fields were already harvested, and the house was warm with the wood stove Wallace had installed in September. They named him Daniel Arthur Talbot, Daniel for the sound of it and Arthur for Nora's father, and he arrived with a full head of dark hair and an expression of apparent outrage at the cold that made the midwife, a capable woman from Medicine Lodge named Mrs. Hargrove, laugh outright. Wallace held him for the first time with the careful hands of a man who is holding the most important thing he has ever held, and he looked at Nora where she lay exhausted and brilliant in the lamplight, and he could not speak for a moment because there were no words adequate to the size of what he felt. "Hello, Daniel," Nora said, when Wallace brought the baby to her. "Welcome to Kansas." She looked up at Wallace. "He has your jaw." "The Lord help him," Wallace said, and Nora laughed, which was the most beautiful sound Daniel Arthur Talbot heard in the first minutes of his life. The years that followed on the Talbot claim had the quality of good things built slowly and kept carefully. Wallace worked the land with the same methodical care he brought to all things, reading it with the attention he had always given to the world around him, learning its rhythms and its needs, expanding the acreage as his resources allowed. By 1883, he had added 60 acres to the original claim, purchased from a homesteader to the east who had decided that Kansas was not for him and had sold at a fair price. The ranch grew in the particular way that real things grow, not in sudden dramatic expansions but in steady, reliable increments: a new fence line, a second barn, a proper corral for the horses. Nora taught. She had not abandoned the thing she had been trained for and loved. In the spring of 1881, the small community that was forming around their section of country needed a school teacher, and Nora presented herself and her normal school, training to the informal school board of 3 ranching families, and they hired her with the enthusiasm of people who have been hoping for exactly this. She taught 4 days a week in a small building the community had constructed near the crossroads, 10 children in the beginning, and growing to 15 within 2 years as more families settled the area. She was, by all accounts and by her own reckoning, an excellent teacher, in the way that people are excellent at things they love and were meant for. Daniel grew from a baby of outraged opinions to a small boy of extraordinary curiosity, and his father's habit of watching the world carefully before speaking about it. By the time he was 3, he was following Wallace around the ranch with the focused intensity of a person in training, asking questions about everything, and listening to the answers with a seriousness that made Wallace feel, simultaneously, that he was the most important person in the world, and that he had better be careful never to give this child inaccurate information. In the spring of 1883, Nora told Wallace they were expecting their second child with the same quality of important stillness she had brought to the first announcement, and he responded with the same immediate warmth, though this time he managed not to knock over the chair. Their second child, born in October, was a boy they named James Samuel, the Samuel for Wallace's cousin who had opened his home without hesitation on the 5th day of the most consequential journey of both their lives. Samuel and Catherine came to visit when James was 3 weeks old, Catherine holding the baby with the expression of a woman reconsidering certain of her life choices, and Samuel shaking Daniel's hand very seriously and listening to Daniel's account of the ranch with the attentive respect he accorded all people who were telling him things in good faith. They stayed 3 days, and the evenings were long and good, the 4 of them and Daniel around the lamplight, James sleeping in his cradle near the stove, and the conversation ranging across everything that friends who love each other and live their separate lives talk about when they are together at last. The small and large things, the difficult and the wonderful, the ways the world is changing, and the ways it is staying the same. On the last evening before Samuel and Catherine headed back north, Wallace and Samuel sat on the porch after the women had gone in, with the October night very clear and cold around them, and the stars burning overhead in their old and reliable patterns. "You should have seen her face," Wallace said, not explaining what he meant because Samuel had known him long enough to follow the thought. "When?" Samuel asked. "The second morning when we turned north instead of south." He looked at the stars. "The way she looked at the road when we changed direction, I think about that sometimes." "I expect you will think about it for the rest of your life," Samuel said. "Yes," Wallace agreed. "I expect I will." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "You know, when she arrived at our place, Catherine said something to me in the kitchen while you were bringing in the wagon. She said, 'That man is in love and he does not know it yet.' I told her it had been 4 days. She told me that was entirely sufficient and that I had known her for 2 weeks before I was past retrieving, and that I had no standing to establish minimums." Wallace smiled at the dark. "Catherine is generally right." "Yes," Samuel agreed, with the specific peace of a man who has accepted this truth entirely and considers it one of the better facts of his life. They sat in the comfortable dark, and the stars moved overhead in their ancient, indifferent beauty, and the sounds of the ranch at night were all around them. The horses in the barn, the creek, the late insects of October making their brief music. And inside the house, the lamp burned warm and gold in the window, and the voices of the women, and the small, persistent voice of Daniel, who had been supposed to be asleep for 2 hours, were audible at the edge of hearing. In the years that came after, the Talbot Ranch grew into something substantial. By 1886, they had 180 acres under active use, a solid herd of cattle, the horse operation that Wallace had expanded carefully, and the school where Nora taught had been rebuilt slightly larger by community effort and served 22 children. They had become people of their community in the way that happens when you have been somewhere long enough and given enough of yourself to a place that it has given itself back to you. The injustice of the era was not absent from their awareness. They watched the continued enclosure of lands that had sustained other people for generations, watched the policy of forced removal play out in the newspapers, and the occasional direct evidence of it that came through their part of Kansas, the passing groups of people being moved by the machinery of federal policy that was efficient and largely merciless. Wallace wrote about it in his notebook, the things he saw and heard, the details that official accounts flattened out of existence, and Nora talked about it with her students in the careful, honest way she talked about difficult things, not pretending the world was simple when it was not, but also not despairing, choosing instead to give the children the capacity to see clearly and form their own considered judgments, which she believed was the most important thing a teacher could offer. On a September evening in 1887, 8 years after the morning they had turned a wagon north on a Kansas trail and changed both their lives, Wallace found Nora in the kitchen garden in the last light, harvesting the late-season vegetables with Daniel, who was nearly 7 now, and had grown into a serious-faced boy with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, that changeable amber brown that shifted with the light. James, 4 years old and constitutionally incapable of the focused attention his brother employed, was conducting some private investigation near the garden fence that involved a great deal of crouching and a stick. Wallace stood at the edge of the garden and watched them, his family in the September evening light, Nora moving with the easy grace of a woman at home in her body and her place, Daniel beside her earnest and careful, James periodically announcing his findings in a manner that suggested they were of universal significance. Nora looked up and saw him watching, and she straightened and looked back at him across the garden with the amber-warm eyes that still, after 8 years of marriage and 2 children and every ordinary and extraordinary day that makes up a life, made something move in his chest that had no better name than what it was. She smiled at him, the full one. The one he had first seen on the 3rd afternoon of the trail ride, sitting by the creek in the April sun, and that had not changed in all the time since, still full and warm and slightly helpless, still the most entirely beautiful thing he had ever seen. He walked into the garden, and she put her free hand in his, dirt on her fingers and a basket of late tomatoes on her arm, and they stood together in the low gold light with their sons moving around them in the way of children, continuous and alive, and completely absorbed in their own important businesses. And the whole evening felt like the inside of something he might have once written in his notebook. The way the light catches on the particular thing that matters. And the way the air holds still for a moment as though the world itself is paying attention. "Are you all right?" Nora asked, looking at him. "Yes," he said, "I was just looking." "At what?" He looked at her, at their sons, at the garden and the house and the fields beyond where the last summer light was golden on the grass, at the creek that ran year-round now that he knew every bend of, at the sky that was turning the color of old bronze in the west and the deepest blue in the east, at everything that was precisely and entirely his life. "At all of it," he said. Nora squeezed his hand and looked with him at the same things, and they stood in the September evening together, not speaking, because everything that needed to be said had been said over 8 years of mornings and evenings, and the daily accumulation of a life built on honesty and kindness, and the courage to turn north when the road was going the wrong way. Later that evening, with the boys asleep and the house quiet around them, Wallace sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and wrote the entry for the day, a habit he had not broken in 15 years. He wrote about the light in the garden. He wrote about the sound of Daniel explaining something to James with the patient seriousness of a 7-year-old who believes in the proper transmission of knowledge. He wrote at the end a single line, which was not a literary flourish but simply the accurate notation he had always preferred, a record of the true thing. "She asked my name at sundown, and I never delivered her to that ranch, and every good thing in my life proceeds from those 2 facts." He closed the notebook and put it in his vest pocket, and went to where Nora was sitting by the lamp in the sitting room with a new book open on her lap, a volume of poems by Emily Dickinson that had arrived in the post from her aunt in Ohio. And she looked up at him when he came in with the expression she had for him that was specific and constant and his, entirely his, and he sat down beside her on the settee, and she leaned against his shoulder and read aloud to him in the lamplight. Her voice steady and clear and carrying inside it the sound of everything that was home. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, and the creek ran its clear dark music through the land that was theirs, and the horses moved quietly in the barn, and somewhere a night bird called once and went still, and the world settled into the deep content of late evening in a place where people are exactly where they mean to be. Daniel Arthur Talbot, nearly 7 years old and supposed to be soundly asleep, lay in his bed with his eyes open and listened to his mother's voice reading through the wall, and the sound of it, familiar and warm and entirely safe, was the last thing he heard before sleep came for him, the same sound his grandfather had given his mother on winter evenings in Ohio long ago, one generation passing to the next the particular gift of being read to by someone who loves you. The inheritance of attention and care, and the belief that what is beautiful and true is worth the time it takes to share it. Wallace Talbot fell asleep that night in his own house on his own land with his wife against his shoulder, and the notebook in his pocket, and the quiet certainty that a man could ask for nothing more honest or good than what he had. And he woke the next morning in the same contentment, and the morning after that, and all the mornings that came after, for a very long time.